Welcome to the latest episode of the Lawrence University Career Center podcast. I'm Ty Collins, and today is a very special episode, part one of an interview with a very special guest, Appleton Mayor Jake Woodford from the Lawrence University class of 2013. Jake graduated with a degree in government, and while at Lawrence, was the president of the Lawrence University Community Council, member of the Judicial Board, student member of the Trustee Committee on Student Affairs, and the recipient of the Campus Life Award for outstanding leadership and service to the university community. Upon graduation, Jake was hired on as the assistant to the president under former President Mark Burstein, a position he held until 2020 when he was elected mayor of Appleton. In the first part of our discussion, we'll talk about Jake's time at Lawrence and how it prepared him for a career in public service. We'll discuss how Jake decided to run for office, his campaign for mayor, and get his take on the current state of political discourse. Mr. Mayor, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you, and hopefully our conversation's helpful.
All right, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to start with your time at Lawrence. You were a government major and were very active around campus. Let's talk about some of the ways you were involved outside the classroom and your decision to be so active while you were on campus.
Well, I've never really known any other way. This goes back to my elementary school days. I started getting involved in extracurricular activities right from the start. And so really at Lawrence, that was just a continuation of the way I'd always been, which was getting involved with the things that are happening in my community and wherever that community is, whatever that community is. And so on campus, that took a lot of different forms. And that was one of the things I really appreciated about Lawrence was how rich that environment is when it comes to opportunities to connect with people and people from different perspectives and to connect with the things that are interesting, compelling to us. That was certainly my experience.
What were some of the activities you were involved with, maybe some of the bigger ones?
Like many students, I had to work to make my way through college. And so I had a couple of jobs on campus that helped with that, some work study jobs. So I had a job in admissions where I was the overnight host coordinator, and then in the campus center where I started as a member of the tech crew in the campus center and then eventually became a manager of that group. And so those were the big jobs on campus. Those roles really gave me a lot of exposure to students from different courses of study, folks I wouldn't have ordinarily crossed paths with, and especially as an overnight host coordinator, where part of the goal was to have as many Laurentians participating as overnight hosts as possible. And that really ran the gamut of all of the different courses of study on campus and campus involvements and affiliations. And that was another great way to meet people across the campus. And so those student jobs were really important in terms of forming relationships and building perspective. I was a member of a fraternity, and initially I thought that was going to be the place where I was really involved and where I put my energy in terms of involvement and engagement and maybe seeking leadership roles in that organization. But as time went on, I started to realize my interests were in some cases a little bit different than the interests of the group and maybe a little bit broader in terms of the kinds of things I want to be a part of and get involved in. And that ultimately led me to running for LUCC president. And so that was a pivotal moment that kind of set in motion some of the more significant developmental experiences that I had and ultimately what led me to working at Lawrence and then created a learning lab that helped me prepare to run for office and serve as mayor of the city of Appleton.
You graduated in June of 2013. You walked across stage, were handed your diploma, and then immediately went to work as the assistant to the president, later be promoted to the secretary of the board of trustees. I'd like to talk about that transition from being a student right into being the assistant to the president and how you transitioned so quickly into that role.
First of all, just going back, I had no intention of going to Lawrence. I grew up in Appleton, was born and raised here, went to public school here in Appleton. And as I was looking at colleges, getting ready to graduate from Appleton North, my grandma called and she said, I just got off the phone with some of our oldest friends, oldest family friends, and they've never been so adamant about anything before. But they say you really need to apply to Lawrence. And I said, well, Grandma, graduating from high school, it's time for me to go and live in a different place and experience that. And she said, well, that's fine, but they said you really have to apply. And it was a week or two later, got my little check from my grandma in the mail for the application fee. And I was like, okay, I can't just cash this check. If she really wants me to do this, I'll do it. So I applied to make my grandma happy. And I figured I should do some due diligence because I was accepted. And so I did not go through formal channels to check out Lawrence. I knew some people that I grew up with in Appleton who went to Lawrence. So I connected with them and did some informal touring and tagging along for classes. And there was something about Lawrence and the way that it felt that really spoke to me. And I was actually on a tour at an institution on the other side of the state. And it was there that I kind of had this realization that I have an opportunity to go to a place that feels right, that is really special. And what am I doing halfway across the state? And so I kind of approached working at Lawrence with the same reticence. When I was getting ready to graduate from Lawrence, had some job prospects lined up, and it was Mark Burstein who talked to me about working at Lawrence after I had explicitly told him I had no interest in working at Lawrence. And he said, well, that's fine, but let's just talk about this. And that started a process where Mark encouraged me to think about taking a role like this in his, at the time, new administration as a developmental opportunity. It's something that I think we both envisioned would be a fairly short term of service. I would work there for a year or two and then move on, either continue my education or move into a different role with a different organization. But as it turned out, I would end up working there for about 6.5 years. And so what that transition was like, though, you're graduating, walking across the stage and into the office, in a lot of ways, it was a deeply familiar environment because I knew the campus so well and the people on it, from the faculty to the staff to students. And of course, I know the community really well. So the bigger transitional pieces, aside from stepping into a professional role and being on staff in a new presidential administration, they were just personal things of like figuring out where to live and making all of those arrangements and having that transitional experience that everybody goes through when they graduate, because I lived on campus all 4 years. But there are definitely things that you learn early in career, right out of college, that are deeply formative. And I certainly had those kinds of experiences right out of the gates working in the president's office.
You mentioned having that job for about 6.5 years, and then you decided to run for mayor of Appleton. Was running for elected office always part of your plans?
I wouldn't say it was part of any big plans that I had. It was always a thought in the back of my mind because I'd had all these experiences and kind of naturally gravitated toward these kinds of roles and engagement in whatever community or organization I was part of. So always in the back of my mind, I was a government major, and so always interested in government and passionate about it. But the plan, if you will, or getting serious about thinking about it, really got started around 2016 and kind of evolved over a period of years. I wouldn't ultimately run for office until the fall of 2019, but those early considerations were really just as I started to learn more about the work of municipal government in particular and the importance of civic engagement in communities, and thinking about, okay, where am I in my career path and what what aspects of my current role are most interesting and applicable. And all of that kind of led to this process of discernment that I went through over a period of solid 3 years, learning everything I could about this job and the people in the city government and the things that city government does. Part of that was, after I talked to Mark about it, he said, well, if this is something that you're seriously considering, then let's think about ways that through your work here, you can learn more about that possibility and also set yourself up well if that's ultimately what you want to do. And I think for me, having a mentor who was willing to entertain that thought and was secure enough in his own leadership and his work to commit to developing me, not for the purpose of his own administration or the organization, but for my own future development and career trajectory. And that was just tremendous. And I can't thank him enough for that. I think that's a great example for mentors and supervisors. And also, I think important for people who are considering working in organizations, especially right out of school. As much as you're interviewing and pitching yourself to a potential employer, I think it's important to ask the kinds of questions about development and support, mentorship, to understand what their philosophies and perspectives are when it comes to helping you grow and develop as a person. I didn't understand that fully when I took the job, because I don't think most of us do when we're.
It's not something we usually ask, right?
Right. But it's such an important part of it, and that development was really, really important for me.
A traditional path in local government when serving as an executive like the mayor would be to first work your way up. You might be an alderman, you might be someone on a planning commission. Did you do anything like that first, or did you go right from working at Lawrence to the mayor's office? And was it that liaison role that kind of helped make that move possible?
Yeah, so it was my primary engagement was through that liaison role. So
Yeah.
I supported the relationship between the university and the city and other local governments. So in Door County also with Bjorklund.
Yeah.
But I did serve as an appointed commissioner on the Appleton Redevelopment Authority, but I did not serve as an alderperson. I didn't run for alder. And part of that for me was trying to be honest and authentic about what my interests are. And I know that my interests are in executive management leadership. And so for me, serving in a role in the legislative branch, well, may be helpful from a profile perspective, wouldn't have been authentic in terms of, yeah, this is really what I want to do. I didn't want to be an alderperson. I still don't. They have a really hard job to do, and I appreciate the work that they do, but that's not the kind of work that I'm necessarily interested in when it comes to local matters and local office. I knew that the work of the mayor was what I wanted to do. So I had to think about ways to leverage the role that I had and the relationships I had in the community to ultimately compile a compelling profile. Because when I started running for office, I had to think about, how am I going to communicate to a community of 75,000 people in the sixth largest city in the state, with a local government that employs over 645 at the time people and has an annual budget of about $190 million, how a 29-year-old presidential assistant in higher education is qualified to run that operation.
Right.
So a lot of it was just, how do I prepare myself as best as possible, but as authentically as possible to take that step.
I do want to get into governing, but before you could govern, you had to run for office. And a lot of our government students do, I meet with a lot of them, they do want to run for office in some capacity someday. So if you could just share with us a little bit about what that first campaign was like, maybe a broader overview as well as kind of the day-to-day.
Yeah, so running for office is a significant undertaking, no matter what office you're running for. And so this is true of aldermanic positions, or, some communities have commissioners and other types of boards where you run to serve in that role. And so there's some fundamentals though that are fairly consistent across all of them. And I would say one of the things that is really important that sometimes gets overlooked is in that process of thinking about running for office, you really should spend a lot of time thinking about if it's really what you want. Is it really what you want to do? You have to burn for this kind of work in a deep way if you're going to be successful and if you're going to enjoy what you do. I think oftentimes people think of running for office as, okay, I'm going to run for office and the campaign's going to be fun and interesting, and I'm going to tell people I'm going to do all these things. And then I'm not going to think about what happens if I lose. All I think about is what happens if I win. And I think anybody considering running for office has to weigh those two considerations really almost equally. What will happen the day after the election if I win? What will happen the day after the election if I lose? And am I prepared? And do I believe in what I'm doing enough to feel okay with the very real possibility that the day after the election, I may have lost? And so I did a lot of thinking about that. And part of that discernment process for me was actually talking with folks at the Career Center at Lawrence. They gave me a copy of a book called Designing Your Life. And if you're not familiar with this book, it's a great read, super, super helpful. And it applies design thinking to imagining careers. And one of the things that was really powerful for me about the concepts in designing your life is that you start to imagine your career trajectory in your life as a set of possibilities. And it's highly iterative. And any one of those possibilities that you start to narrow in on could be very deeply fulfilling and enriching and aligned with who you are. And that was a very freeing notion for me when I was thinking about running for office, because this is a little different than applying for a job. There's a disappointment that can come if you don't get a job that you apply for, but there's a vulnerability in running for office, a personal vulnerability that, especially for me, growing up in this community, I was born and raised here. I'm the fourth generation in my family to live in this community. And so the possibility of running and losing for me had some extra weight, because it was not just going to be my own shame, embarrassment, all those feelings that you can feel when you're not successful, but also that of my family. So there was some weight to that, but that was really helpful and helped me to start feeling secure about the idea of running. And then as I started to prepare the campaign, one of the things that really helped me was Marshall Gans has this public narrative framework. Marshall Gans is on the faculty at the Kennedy School, Harvard Kennedy School, and developed a framework for public narrative. The public narrative framework is really powerful for public officials, but I think it's powerful in lots of different sectors and types of work. So it's widely applicable. But the idea at its highest level is identifying your story of self, your story of us, and the story of now. So it was in applying that framework to a potential run and starting to lay that out where I really felt like I started to get some traction with the campaign, where, story of self, it's what is my personal narrative? Why am I here? What am I doing here? What's this about? How am I prepared to do this work? Story of us, a story of this community and the people in it and the things happening here. And then the story of now, what's happening at this moment in our community, and why does it matter? Why would anyone feel compelled to act in this moment? And in what ways would we like them to act? So that framework was really powerful. And then surrounding myself with people who done political campaigns, who know how this works, and then also learning from other campaigns and other communities and borrowing concepts in terms of just structurally, how do you do it and how do you communicate that effectively? Those things were all really important just in terms of the mechanics. And there's lots of, there's paperwork and there's ordering signs and there's strategy stuff, all of which I felt well prepared for. especially on the strategy side, having been a government major and taken a lot of courses in political advertising and narrative, and just understanding how the electorate broadly moves. That was all really, really helpful in running a successful campaign.
Speaking of campaigns, we are recording this one day before the 2024 election. What's your take on political discourse on this November day in 2024?
Discourse is a generous term, I think. What we're seeing. I think that when we see what's happening in our country right now around this election, and this has been true now for a number of election cycles, the divisiveness of political campaigning, partisan political campaigning, is deeply troubling to me. And it's one of the things that I find most appealing about the role that I serve in, which is a nonpartisan office. So in Wisconsin, nonpartisan offices run for election and re-election in April. And because I've never run for political office, I've never run for partisan office, I've never been a member of a political party or campaign committee, I've really held firmly to the nonpartisan nature of the role that I serve in. It has been very refreshing to approach politics from that standpoint. And I think sometimes we confuse partisanship with values. And you see that a lot in the political campaigning, in partisan political campaigning today. And it should trouble all of us. And it should give all of us pause, I think, because what ends up happening so often is that we use partisan affiliation as a shorthand for understanding someone and understanding their perspectives and how they look at the world or how they would govern. And that flattens people out, and it lacks the kind of dimension that exists in reality, that each person has perspectives and opinions and expertise and experiences that shape who they are and how they move through the world, how they think about issues. And that is missing, in large part, that's missing from a lot of partisan campaigns. And worse yet, we can tap into negative attribution biases to say, not only do I know everything about somebody based on the letter after their name, but if the letter after their name is different from the letter after my name or the party I affiliate with more closely, that their views, their values are anathema to mine, that we're necessarily completely opposed to one another, and there's no room for us to communicate or to navigate issues together. And that to me is tragic, because it misses so much of the opportunity that we have when we don't have to play by those rules. And so by being a nonpartisan elected official, I'm able to better connect across differences in the community in the service of bigger objectives and goals for the community that, if they were partisan aligned in an explicit way, wouldn't necessarily be possible, or would lead to the kind of empty fighting that happens when they're partisan coded. So for me, that's the bigger concern about the moment that we're in. And then also just the level of rancor that we see in political campaigning today. And this isn't unique. I minored in history. So, and I was focused on US history. And so that marriage of history and politics is really strong. And this is not the first time in our country's history that you see the kind of rancor and right, awful divisiveness and outright meanness that plays out in political campaigns. It's not a unique moment in that way. It just feels more present because it's right now. Yeah. But that to me is the bigger concern. And then just the fact that when you run for office, I believe you are already a leader. And so whether you're running for office for the first time, or you're running for re-election, you already hold office, or you're running for a different office, you've already established that you are a leader or want to be a leader in the community. And the words that you use and the things that you do, the way that you conduct yourself, the way you conduct your campaign does set an example for your community, whatever scale of office you're running for. It sets a tone. And if that tone is divisive or cruel or violent, that has an impact on your community.
Right.
And that is deeply concerning to me about the kind of political rhetoric that's being used today. And it's not exclusive to a particular party, because when you have argument and counter argument and these backs and forths, the kind of rhetoric that's used has an effect of dragging everybody into it. And that's really concerning to me. So it's something that I take seriously when I run in everything that I do. When I run for office, when I serve in the role, I'm cognizant of the fact that people are paying attention to what leaders are saying and how they say it and how they treat people. And I want to set an example of being the kind of leader I would be proud of and supportive of, which is someone who leads with compassion and empathy and thoughtfulness. And so that's the kind of example that I try to set in the work that I do, and to be a professional. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case for everybody, and there's lots of reasons for that. We could do a whole hour just on that. But in short, I think we're in a really strange and in some ways frightening moment in the political history of this country, and we as individual citizens have a responsibility in terms of how we choose to engage with that kind of political discourse and the ways that we reward that kind of discourse. And also we have a responsibility to be aware of our own vulnerability to the systems that perpetuate this kind of rhetoric. We're vulnerable to that. And the utilities that we make use of to communicate and to stay connected with each other are also in many cases designed to amplify those kinds of negative messages and those tones that then incite anger and upset and outrage. And we're vulnerable to that. So as consumers, we also have a responsibility to be aware of what we're consuming and what we're being fed, because ultimately it does have real world consequences.
It does, and it sounds like the responsibility for bringing down the tone and the rhetoric is all of ours. This is a good spot to end part one of our interview. Part two is coming up, and that'll focus more on your role as mayor, what you do in the job, as well as taking over as mayor and what that was like since you did it right as the COVID pandemic was beginning. And we'll also talk about the advice you have for Lawrence students as they embark on their careers after Lawrence. So stay tuned. Part two with Appleton Mayor Jake Woodford is coming up.